A story I don't think you've heard before. It's a story of how this city controlled the growth of the United States. Hard to believe, right? Let's start in 1803. 1803, our president was Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, credited with writing the Declaration of Independence. He was an expansionist. He believed in what was known as manifest destiny, which is a belief in those days that if the United States was ever going to become a great nation, it had to expand across the continent from sea to shining sea, all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. That was a tall order in those days. For one thing, the Rocky Mountains extended from Canada to Mexico. They were a formidable barrier to travel from east to west. Jefferson believed that we needed to get to the Pacific Ocean. The first thing he did, of course, was complete the Louisiana Purchase, which was all of the Mississippi River from Minnesota to below New Orleans into the Gulf, and all the tributaries that fed it, and all the land adjacent. It doubled the size of the United States. But he didn't stop there. He commissioned two young Army officers, Lewis and Clark, to conduct an expedition to the Pacific Ocean. Now, in those days, the southwest quadrant of the United States was controlled by Spain. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, parts of Kansas. So when he commissioned Lewis and Clark to reach the Pacific, the only way they could go, of course, was what they called the Northern Passage. This was an exploratory mission, and he gave Lewis and Clark some specific instructions. One, plant the American flag on the Pacific coast to let the world know this is our territory. Two, to determine how rugged and how impassable the Rocky Mountains were. The Spaniards, through their 5 explorers, had pretty well mapped everything in the southern Rockies. 3, he was to determine what the indigenous people were like, the Indians, whether they were friendly or not. And 4, what was the weather like? Hot, cold, whatever. Lewis and Clark embarked in 1804 and returned in 1806 with complete logs, with all the information that Jefferson wanted. And what he found was there was a passage between Idaho and Montana that you could consider it as the Northern Passage, but it was still pretty rugged. And 2, the weather was very, very difficult. In their travels, they had a snowstorm in May. Now, if we're going to expand to the Pacific Ocean, that means we have to move lots of people, not just mountain men, but ordinary families, children, en masse to populate the West Coast. And that was going to be impossible through the north. The Spaniards, in the meantime, had named the pass that we're sitting in the middle of this morning as the Pass of the North, El Paso del Norte. It was the only all-weather, all-year, 24/7 broad pass to the West Coast. The only one that we could possibly move enough people to colonize the West Coast. But the problem was the Spaniards controlled it. It was part of Spain. That presented a problem, but not one that we could not overcome. It, of course, caused some unrest in Spain because they knew what our plan was, that we wanted to colonize the West Coast. The only way to get there is through here, which meant we had our eyes on what was Spanish territory. Well, we resolved it. Took 2 wars, 2 territorial purchases, but we were not to be denied. So let's move to the next step. About 18, 22, 23. Now this is a kind of a side note. A young gentleman by the name of Juan Marie Ponce de Leon immigrated from Spain to Mexico City right after the Mexicans had evicted the Spaniards from North America. Ponce de Leon stayed in Mexico City a year or so, and he was told by the people in Mexico City, all the action's up north. That's where the money can be made, specifically El Paso del Norte, which is today Ciudad Juarez. So he and his family, young family, come, and I'm going to start calling it Juarez because it gets too confusing. He moves to Juarez, and he gets there and he's looking across the Rio Grande. Now, most of the land south of the Rio Grande was already farmed and spoken for. But on the other side, the north side, it was empty. And it looked like really good farmland. So he said, why isn't anybody over there? Well, it's because of the Indians. You know, if they catch any gringo over there or any Spaniard or anybody else, they give them a short haircut. He kept looking at it. He says, I'm willing to risk that. So he goes to the governor of Chihuahua and asks for a land grant on the other side, the north side of the Rio Grande. Governor said, you got it, son. If you're willing to risk it, we would sure like to get some people over there. So he gets his first land grant, about 600 acres, imprisoned at downtown El Paso. The north edge of it was about Paisano Street, down to the river. He doesn't move over there, but he gets enough workers at will, and they build a roundhouse with slit windows, which they can retreat into in case the Indians show up. And they start planting vines, wheat, corn, etc., farming. And he plants quite a farm. This was in 1827. The following spring, the Rio Grande had an exceptional snowfall at the headwaters in Colorado and northern Mexico, and the river became a raging torrent, and it flooded and washed out his entire farm. Now, in those days, there were no farms along the Rio Grande. There was no irrigation ditches, nothing to draw water out of the river. So when it came through big time. So he goes back to the governor. Governor, I got a problem. When the river floods, I lost my entire farm. I need another one. So the governor says, fine. How about if I give you from north, from Paisano, up to Main Street? which is right behind the Plaza Park. Okay, he comes back and he plants the new farm. And in the process over the years becomes a very affluent farmer in what is today downtown El Paso. We're going to leave Ponce de Leon, who, by the way, his ancestor was the guy that wandered around Florida for 10 years looking for the Fountain of Youth. We're going to leave that part and move to the next step. How many of you know what April 21st, 1836 is? Come on. You're Texans. San Jacinto Day. The day Sam Houston defeated Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto, and Texas became a republic. I'm going to back up a little because the story of the Texas Revolution has a direct impact on us, which you might assume. Sam Houston came to Texas in about 30. He'd been governor of Tennessee, had married a young lady and been married 5 days when he had to divorce her, resign as governor of Tennessee, and wanted to start over, so he came to Texas. Sam Houston had been a close friend of Andrew Jackson, who at that time, in 1836, was our president. He'd fought under Jackson in the War of 1812. He comes to Texas, and Texas was in the middle of the beginning where the Texans wanted to be free of Mexico, of Mexican control and rule. They had been brought here, as you may recall, by Stephen F. Austin and his father Moses in a compact with Mexico, who wanted to populate Texas before the Americans came in and took it over. Anyway, Sam comes to Texas, and we're in the beginning of the Texas Revolution. They want to revolt. The president at that time of Mexico was none other than Santa Anna. By the way, he was president of Mexico 5 times, deposed 5 times, in exile twice. Sam gets here, and the Texans are plotting their strategy. And he wants no part of it. He wants to start over. He left the United States in disgrace, he felt. And he didn't want any part of any more causes. About that time, President Jackson sends a messenger and says, "I need to talk to you." Oh, really? Yeah. So he goes back to Washington, and President Jackson says to him, "Sam, I know you don't want to get involved, but whether you want to get involved or not, you've got to get involved." Well, why? The Texans have no chance against an army as strong and well-trained as Santa Anna has. They had no chance. You're a former military officer that I have a lot of respect for. You need to go back to Texas and start building an army that can fight Santa Anna. If they try it right now, it's over. He says, "I'm going to tell you, we need Texas." Now, everybody assumes it's just because we want Texas. He says, but there's more to it than that. If we're going to continue manifest destiny, we've got to have Texas in order to get control of the pass. He says, I can't tell people that, Because if I say that, the Mexicans are going to say, we're inciting war, and we're going to have a war, and Congress isn't going to like that. So Sam comes back to Texas, as you know, organizes the army, and we can go through it. There were 4 battles. The war lasted 6 months, and the first one was at Gonzales, which the Texans won. The second was the Alamo that occurred in last week of February and the first week of March, in which Santa Anna finally breached the wall. A lot of famous Texans were in there, Bowie, Crockett, breached the wall. Those Texans that weren't killed during the battle, Santa Anna executed and burned their bodies. He then went to Goliad and did the same thing, where there was a small contingent of Texas soldiers. The end of this was that Sam Houston, who had the main army around Victoria, started retreating along the coastal plain toward Houston, which wasn't Houston in those days. He realized he could not take Santa Anna on in a pitched battle front to front. So he retreated till he got into the thickets along the San Jacinto River below Houston. And Santa Anna camped that night. And Santa Anna was a good tactician, but lazy. He didn't post sentries. And the next morning, Sam Houston, who had about 450 troops, Santa Anna had 1,500. They were just getting up for late breakfast, all in their long johns. They didn't have their rifles, they'd been stacked. And in 18 minutes, Sam Houston routed the Mexican army. They panicked when he charged in, scattered, and he defeated Santa Anna. Santa Anna tried to escape dressed as a private. When they found him the next day with about 30 other Mexican troops, they brought him back to the compound. And as soon as he walked in this private's uniform, all the soldiers stood up and say, "Mi presidente," gave him away. So they took him to Sam Houston, who in the battle had been shot in the ankle. He was wounded, lost a lot of blood. They take him, Santa Anna, to Houston, and Houston tells him, "You're going to sign a surrender treaty here and now. It's going to have 2 conditions in it," which was our first big mistake. The conditions were that Santa Anna and his army would leave Texas and never come back. And number 2, that the Republic of Mexico would recognize the Republic of Texas as a free and independent entity. What they didn't agree to, and turned out to be costly, they did not firmly establish the border between Texas and Mexico. Now, by the time Santa Anna got back to Mexico, they'd deposed him because he lost Texas. He wasn't very popular. And he denied that Texas was now free and independent, and so did the Mexican government. We've heard this before. They didn't count all the ballots. So the Mexicans, although realized that there had to be a boundary, said it was the Nueces River, which comes down kind of west of Fort Worth, near San Angelo, south to almost Uvalde, and then turns southeast through Corpus Christi Bay. And that, as far as the Mexican government was concerned, was the boundary. Whereas the Texan says, no. It's the Rio Grande. You call it the Rio Bravo. But that's the boundary. They never agreed. So for the duration of the Republic of Texas, which was 9 years, there was a dispute, and it was called the Nueces Strip, and it was never fully fixed until the next war. Now let's move to the next phase, the Republic of Texas. Texas became a republic, of course, in 1836, and for 9 years it was an independent republic. It wasn't a pleasant 9 years. And I'm going to back up here. What was one of the big problems, the Nueces River, as I said, ran north and south. So it excluded all of West Texas, including El Paso, remained part of the Republic of Mexico. Only the East Texas above the Nueces Strip was the Republic of Texas. Well, we get to be a republic, and a lot of people say, well, why didn't they contest this? Why did they give away all of West Texas? The Republic of Texas struggled from the day one. There was not enough people here, they didn't have enough money, and they started running a deficit from day one. They didn't have the ability to administer what was the Republic then, in effect, East Texas, much less the rest of Texas. So they didn't really argue that much about it. Within 3 months after we became a republic, now we had 3 presidents of the republic. The first was Sam Houston, served 3 years. The next was Mirabeau Lamar, served 3 years. The third was Sam Houston again. And the last one, for a short term, was Anson Jones. He presided over the annexation. We struggled. We incurred a huge debt. We couldn't administer what we had. So Sam Houston sent a delegation to Washington because in that conversation he'd had with Andrew Jackson, who was still president, that it was important, that Texas was important to the United States because, among other things, the pass. He assumed that if we asked to be annexed, Jackson would agree immediately, but he didn't. This country has been scourged by current politics. We see it today. The problem in those days was slavery. It divided the nation, ultimately resulting in the Civil War. But all the politicians, just like now, they're more interested not in what needs to be done for the country, but what will get them reelected. And slavery was a huge issue that would get you either elected or unelected. Jackson, Texas, if it came into the Union, would have been a slave state. And Jackson didn't want to touch that if he didn't have to. And Sam Houston played into his hands when we didn't set the border because El Paso was not included. And that was one of the things, long range, that Jackson felt needed to be done. If I can't have that, why am I going to touch the time bomb and bring Texas into the slave state? So he, without even considering, said no. We struggled for another couple of years, and we approached Great Britain. And We asked Great Britain to mediate and see if there was some way a rapprochement could be made with Mexico. Could we return to Mexico with certain conditions, governance, taxes, etc.? Mexico, I said, no. Why should we? Texas is going to collapse any day now, and we can walk back up there and take it with no conditions. So that went out the window. We struggled and struggled. And finally, our president, John Tyler, in 1841, he assumed office. He was an independent. He actually was elected vice president under William Henry Harrison, who was inaugurated in March of 1841 and died 30 days after he was inaugurated, and John Tyler, the vice president, took office. Tyler was a firm believer in the manifest destiny, and since he was not aligned with any party, he felt he could finally pursue the annexation of Texas because it was desperately needed. He made various attempts, none of which worked. The way normally a state would be brought in would be with a treaty that was approved by 2/3 vote of the Senate. But Tyler also figured out, I can bypass this if I have a simple majority of both houses of Congress to issue an invitation. Well, now, up to then, the House of Representatives was never involved in these important decisions. And when Tyler said, I'm going to use you, you're going to be part of the decision, they jumped on board like you wouldn't believe. Finally, in 1845, just before Tyler was to leave office and Polk was to come in, like 8 days, he got enough majority in both houses to pass the annexation bill, and with that, he dispatched a courier to Texas who had to vote whether to become part of the United States. And Texas legislature voted to accept and become the 28th state. We had 27 at the time. But you know us Texans, nothing's easy. We'd been begging to become part of the United States. We send back the message, we've got some conditions you got to meet for us to become a state. Well, what's that? Well, the first thing, you got to assume our debt. Well, Congress had already kind of figured that out, because if Texas couldn't pay it and they came in, the United States was going to have to pay it. But the second one was that Texas would retain all of its public lands. The only state in the United States where the state retains its public lands. We have somebody sitting here today who was on the Texas Land Board, right? Mr. Ted Houghton, who was formerly head of TxDOT. A little aside, most of the public land that Texas retained was in West Texas, a part that didn't fall under the Republic. When we retained those lands, we put them under the Texas Land Board, and they in turn lease the mineral rights and the use of the land, and the money goes into the PUF fund, correct? The PUF fund is a public university fund which uses that revenue. It's distributed between the University of Texas and Texas A&M 2/3 for Texas, 1/3 for A&M, to build buildings, public improvements. Back to the annexation. The third thing was that Texas retained the right to divide itself into 5 states. And I guess that's into perpetuity. We haven't tested that. That caused a little problem because there were only 27 states, which meant there were 54 senators. If we come in and divide into 5, we're going to have 10 senators. And that caused them a little bit of angst. But they accepted it all, and we become the 28th state. We're now to the part where we've got a problem with Mexico. Mexico had publicly stated that if Texas was annexed into the United States, it was the equivalent of declaring war on Mexico. So immediately, President Polk dispatched a cadre of troops to what the United States and Texas considered the border, the Rio Grande. And with that, Santa Anna, who's back in power again, sends his army, a portion of it, north, and they come across the river, attack the U.S. soldiers, and there was a couple of them killed. With that, Polk says that's war. He goes to Congress, asks them to declare war against the Republic of Mexico, which we do. He then goes to General Winfield Scott, who was head of the Army at that time, and says, General, we're going to have to put an end to this. You're going to have to invade Mexico. And how do you want to do it? Give me a plan and the time. Scott says, well, I'll tell you what. First thing I want to do is I want to bring back Zachary Taylor, who had been a general some years earlier and became a president. And he said, I want Zachary Taylor to take part of the army and invade Mexico from the Rio Grande going south. The main purpose of that is to keep as much of Santa Anna's army occupied as I can while I invade from the east coast of Mexico across from Mexico City, about Veracruz. His army went by ship. He told President Polk, it'll take me about 6 months and I can get it done. Well, it turned out it took a year and a half, 46 to 47. But he finally encircled Mexico City, and Santa Anna had to surrender. In the meantime, Zachary Taylor's army had gotten into Mexico 500 or 600 miles, had lost a battle, and took 300 prisoners and put them in prison. One of them was none other than Ben Dowell, our first mayor. The war is over. We now have a firm boundary between the United States and Texas, and that's the Rio Grande River, which goes northwest. When it goes through the pass, it turns due north immediately up into the Colorado Creed. We have the pass now, which we need, which we've wanted. The problem is, once you go through the pass, you're back into Mexico again. That didn't really solve anything. So, as part of the treaty, the Guadalupe-Hidalgo Treaty that settled the Mexican-American War, the United States purchased for $15 million, I believe it was, all of Mexican territory, which included West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Upper California it was called, Nevada, Utah, parts of Colorado. We bought it all, thinking that that was going to finally solve our problem of getting to the West Coast. The boundary at that point was about where Interstate 10 leaves Las Cruces and goes to Lordsburg. Everything below that remained Mexican. So the Transcontinental Railroad, primarily the Southern Pacific Railroad, who had wanted to start building and come through El Paso, but they still couldn't. Because if you built, let me back up. The boundary was in New Mexico was about Interstate 10. When it got to Arizona, it curved north, west, till it got to the outskirts of what would become Phoenix, and then curved back southwest to Yuma, a big bubble. If you're going to build a railroad, you've got to go around that through the mountains of northeast Arizona, come in somewhere around Hatch, and then come down the east side of the Rio Grande. And that was not acceptable. It was too difficult. The weather wouldn't be all year round. So we have one last purchase. In 1854, the United States initiates the Gadsden Purchase, which purchased the land south of the border down to where it is today. The U.S. border, as you know, comes in about Mount Cristo Rey and across to Yuma. And that took care, finally, where the railroad could start coming to El Paso. We had 5, 6 railroads come through here in a matter of 3 or 4 years. But what that did was, through the foresight of several presidents and the willingness of our people to believe that we needed to expand to the West Coast, it took 2 wars and 2 purchases to get it done. It wasn't an easy proposition. Now, if you don't really believe that that's important, I can remember, I'm not that old, but I can remember sitting on a bus in 1942 and 3, where they were dispatched from Plaza Park in those days. I remember one time sitting on a bus for over an hour, waiting for the trains to clear. It was a nightmare. This was the hub of the movement of troops and goods and everything from one coast to the other. A military historian told me one time, it becomes questionable if we could have ever fought a war on both the Atlantic and the Pacific if we had not had El Paso. It was that critical to move troops, goods, munitions. So this pass controlled the growth of the United States. That's how important our mission was. Now I'm going to conclude with just a short, because somebody wanted to know about some mayors. El Paso incorporated and held their first council meeting in August of 1873. Our first mayor was by the name of Ben Dow, which I pointed out had been part of Zachary Taylor's army and captured. He was from Kentucky. He was a young man. He just married, before he was drafted, a young girl who was a daughter of a very wealthy farming family in Kentucky. When he was sent down through Texas to become part of the army, he saw things that really interested him. So when he's mustered out and he goes home back to Kentucky, he walks in and tells his wife, he says, "The real action's out west, dear, and we're moving. We're going to go to California." She looked at him and said, "You got to be kidding. I have everything I need right here. Why am I going to go to California where the Indians get you?" So she divorced him. And he takes off. He goes to San Antonio, where the wagon trains left from going to California through El Paso. He gets on one, gets as far as El Paso, and he runs into the big farming community that Ponce de Leon had. Well, he worked for a few months and then went on to California, built houses. Then he came back, stayed in El Paso. Now, what I didn't finish with Ponce de Leon was Ponce de Leon had the Mexican land grant, these farms, right? In the Mexican-American War at the end, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, among other things, stated that the United States government would recognize Spanish land grants, primarily in California. Nothing about Mexican land grants. So when the United States won the war, poor old Ponce de Leon gets nervous because the army's on their way out under General Van Horn. They're going to establish a post in El Paso, and one of the things they're going to do is probably confiscate my land. So he looks around and he finds one of the old Spanish traders that ran ox trains from Santa Fe to Chihuahua with goods and on it, equipment. And most of them ended up, there was about 5 or 6 of them, settling in El Paso. That was the midpoint, and where the toughest part of it was they had to cross the river. There was no bridges. That included Franklin Coons, Stevenson, Hart. These gentlemen all established homes here. He looked around, and the only guy that was willing to buy his interest, his farm, was Franklin Coons. So he sold to Franklin on the time payment plan. And Franklin's idea was he was going to subdivide and sell lots. But he got a big customer in the United States Army who was going to establish a post here, which did. And he rented it to him, and he was able to make his payments off of that. The problem was the United States Army stayed here 1 year and then moved to Fort Selden above Las Cruces, leaving him with no ability to make his mortgage payments. He defaulted, and Ponce de Leon's family by then repossessed and then resold it. McGoffin was one of them, and they hired Anson Mills, I think it was, the surveyor, to produce the first survey of downtown El Paso, which y'all have seen. Name the streets. And they bought it, and they subdivided, and we were off. I think, our mayor, Ben Dow, came back to El Paso, and he opened a saloon. And he also was a stage stop for the Butterfield stage line. His saloon was where the Del Norte Hotel is today. And he got elected mayor. And the first council meeting, they passed 5 ordinances that the public had demanded. One, you couldn't bathe. Ponce de Leon, in order to water his farms on the upper grant, had to dig an irrigation ditch from around Hart's Mill across along San Francisco Street to bring water to his farm. And that was the only water the city had. It was the beginning of the El Paso water utilities. When Dow took office and the council met, the first ordinance was you can't bathe in the canal. Number 2, you can't let livestock in the canal. Number 3, you can't cuss in saloons. Number 4, you can't pitch pennies. And number 5, you can't play marbles for keeps. A week later, the council meets again. And this time, they convene as the appraisal district, because in Texas, all the revenue for the city comes from property tax. So they convene as the appraisal district and set the value on all the pieces of property within the city. In those days, there were about 600 people living in El Paso. And based on the tax rate they set, the total value, income would have been about $650. They post the notice on the newspaper tree. Remember that downtown in Placita? Nobody paid. They got $25. And for 2 years, they tried to exist with no income. Finally, one of his council, 2-year terms, like when I was there, one of his council members by the name of Jones said, he was a lawyer. He says, I'm going to run against you, and I'm going to collect the taxes. So he gets elected. And try as he might for a year, he didn't collect them either. So he convenes the council after 3 years of being a city, tells the council, this isn't working. If they won't pay, we can't exist. So they write a letter to the governor and send the charter back and says, we're out of business. And we're not a city, an incorporated city, for 4 years until 1880, when the railroads arrived. And the population jumped to about 13,000. Now, if you've followed any of the local news recently, this would have been the 150th anniversary of the incorporation of El Paso, 1873. People think the city's that old. It's not. El Paso #1 was incorporated in 1873. But El Paso #2 was reincorporated in 1880. So we're only 143 years old. And some of the newspapers didn't quite catch on to that. Not that I hope you've learned something, enjoyed it, or whatever. It's an amazing city. It really is. We're responsible for a lot more than we know, and you ought to be proud of it. Thank you.